In the humid hush of Vicksburg, Mississippi, where the river fog crept into the streets like fingers searching for secrets, there was a man who knew how to move unnoticed. His name was Ezekiel Graves, 35 years carved into his face with quiet precision, his skin dark and smooth, his eyes deep wells that reflected nothing back. He drove an old black hack, a taxi that had no company name, no license number, just a dull sheen of dust from the dirt roads and a silent presence that made it seem like it had always existed, waiting for passengers who never asked too many questions. Ezekiel's cab was a lifeline for many, especially for those who lived in the folds of society where no one else would come. In the 1920s South, a black man offering a service that crossed invisible lines was both a rare convenience and a quiet rebellion. The white folks didn't look twice at him. After all, to them, he was just another colored man who knew his place. But among his own, Ezekiel was respected in a way that didn't require words. He was the man you called when you needed a ride, and no one else would answer. The streets of Vicksburg whispered his name, not out of affection, but out of necessity. He was the cabman who would pick you up after a long shift at the cotton mills, or when you missed the last ferry across the Yuzu River. He was reliable, silent. You never had to tell him twice. And yet there was an undercurrent, a tremor beneath his reputation, one that made even the most desperate hesitate before hailing him too late in the evening. It started with small things. A field worker named Ajoja, who went out drinking one Saturday night and never came home. Folks said he had taken Ezekiel's cab after the juke joint closed. Then there was Lottie Mae, a washerwoman, last seen waving down Ezekiel at the corner of Magnolia Street. Her family said she had a suitcase packed ready to visit her sister in Jackson, but she never arrived. The sheriff's office didn't bother much with the cases. Colored folks went missing all the time, they said. Maybe they ran off. Maybe they got themselves in trouble. The law had other matters to attend to. But the colored community kept count. They noticed how those who vanished had all been seen with Ezekiel in the hours before. Thyre disappearance, yet no one accused him, not directly. To accuse a man like Ezekiel was to disturb the fragile balance they lived under, where every service, every gesture of help within the black community was a shield against the outside world. He was quiet, courteous, always nodding politely, tipping his cap. The idea that behind that stillness lurked something monstrous was too heavy a truth for Mosto Carey. Ezekiel knew this. He had learned the art of invisibility early, watching his father scrub floors in silence, watching his mother stitch white folks' clothes while swallowing their insults. He understood that in a world built to ignore you, a man could carve out his own rules if he kept his head down and his mouth shut. Driving the cab was more than a job. It was a cloak. Behind the wheel, he became untouchable. Passengers got in. They got out. No one asked what happened in between. On the surface, his life was methodical. He rented a small room above a boarded-up barber shop. He ate at the same diner every morning. A plate of grits and coffee, nothing more. He attended church, sat in the back pew, and left before the final hymn. No one could recall a time when Ezekiel raised his voice or even laughed. He was a shadow that passed through the town with precise, calculated steps, and yet, under the veneer of quiet routines, a different rhythm pulsed, a hunger, roar impatient, gnawing at the edges of his restraint. Late at night, when the streets were empty, save for the croak of frogs and the rustle of swamp grass, Ezekiel would cruise slowly, his headlights dimmed, scanning the sidewalks. He looked for the ones who wouldn't be missed, the drunks stumbling out of Bali bars, the laborers who had no family in town, the lone women whose homes were miles away from the nearest neighbors. His face remained expressionless, but inside he was measuring, deciding. The process was never rushed. He'd pull up quietly, offer a ride with a nod. No words needed. Once the door closed, the cab transformed into a cage. Ezekiel had altered the handles, fixed them so they wouldn't open from the inside. The locks were silent. The windows only rolled down an inch. His passengers never noticed until it was too late. The route would seem normal at first, past the familiar shops, the rusted rail tracks, but then the cab would veer onto dirt roads into the woods where moonlight barely touched the ground. What Ezekiel did in those woods wasn't spoken of. But the swamp always knew. The Yazoo River with its murky depths and tangled roots swallowed secrets whole. And within the darkest pockets of the swamp, a small shack stood hidden from the world. That shack was home to a family that didn't belong to the town stories. They were a family of silence and hunger, dependent on what Ezekiel brought back in the trunk of his cab. But those are truths that will come later. For now, in the heart of Vicksburg, Ezekiel remained a figure of eerie respect. The whisper sconsioned, but they were soft, scared. People looked the other way because to face the possibility that the quiet cabman was more than just a driver, that he was a hunter, was a confrontation with a horror too intimate to bear. Ezekiel never needed to hide in the shadows because the town itself provided the perfect cover in a world where black lives were deemed disposable. Where justice was selective and empathy rationed, Ezekiel operated with a terrifying freedom. His cab wasn't just a vehicle, it was a moving coffin, a final ride for those no one would search for, no one would mourn. And as the sun dipped below the river, casting long, crooked shadows across the cobbled streets, the black cab would roll out once more, its driver with hands steady on the wheel, eyes scanning for the next fare. In Vicksburg, when the night swallowed the town, Ezekiel Graves was not just a man offering a ride. He waited for Amen. Deep within the suffocating heart of the Yazoo River swamp, far beyond where the town's dirt roads gave up, and the cypress trees wear upon themselves into walls, stood a shack that most maps pretended did not exist. It wasn't much more than a skeleton of warped wood and rusted nails, leaning precariously on stilts driven into the soft, rotting earth. The air here was thicker, heavier, as if the swamp exiled secrets that never reached the outside world. This was not just Ezekiel Graves' home, it was his family's cage, and it was the reason his taxi roamed the streets at night. Inside the shack, time was a thing that had curled up and died. The walls were bare, save for streaks of mildew and the faint scratches of fingernails worn down to bone. The single window was permanently fogged, offering a blurred view of a world that had long since forgotten the souls inside. Ezekiel's family existed in a space between life and death, their bodies fragile, their minds gnawed to shreds by hunger and isolation. His mother, Marin Solar, sat by the fireplace, though there was no fire, her lips moving in silent prayers to gods that never answered. Her skin clung to her bones like thin parchment, her eyes pale with a glaze that saw things no one else could. Ezekiel's wife, Ruth, moved like a specter, pacing the shack in slow, deliberate steps as if mapping out a route she could never escape. Her hair hung in tangled ropes, her fingernails were chipped and ragged from clawing at walls that never opened. She had not spoken in months. Words had become useless things in a place where survival depended on something more primal. And then there were the children, 3 small figures, shadows more than flesh, their ribs pressing against their skin, their eyes vast and empty like cracked porcelain dolls. They never laughed, never cried. They simply watched, wide-eyed and starving, as their father came and went, their thin limbs wrapped around each other as if to remind themselves they still existed. Hunger had hollowed them out, not just in body, but in soul. Their minds had begun to drift into strange places, realms where the boundaries of right and wrong had dissolved into the stench of rotting meat. Ezekiel had not chosen this life out of cruelty. Once years ago, there had been dreams of freedom, of working the riverboats, of buying land away from the claws of white overseers. But dreams that feed starving children, dreams don't pay when the town refuses to hire a black man for honest work. The swamp, however, took no notice of color or ambition. It simply opened its arms and swallowed those the world discarded. So Ezekiel built the shack, and when the crops failed and the last coins dried up, he found other ways to keep his family alive. It began with rabbits, squirrels, anything he could trap. But there are limits to how much the swamp gives. It wasn't long before the animals vanished. The traps returned empty, and the eyes of his family grew more hollow by the day. Then came the night when Ezekiel, desperate and trembling, brought home his first fare. It was a drifter, a nameless man who wouldn't be missed, whose body provided enough meat to keep the family breathing for a week. The line that separated man from beast, right from survival, blurred. That night, and Ezekiel discovered something the swamp had always known. Hunger doesn't care about morality. Over time, it became a ritual. Ezekiel would return late at night, the heavy thud of the trunk announcing his arrival. His family would stir, awakened by the scent of fresh flesh, their movements growing frantic as the makeshift butcher's block was prepared. Marmon Solar, despite her brittle frame, would oversee the process with eerie precision, her gnarled hands moving with the grace of a priestess performing a sacred rite. Ruth, silent and methodical, would clean the bones, stripping them with a focus that bordered on reverence. The children, once squeamish, now assisted without flinching, their small fingers deftly plucking sinew and marrow, their mouths watering. In anticipation, in that shack, the act of consumption became more than survival. It became communion. Each meal was a renewal of their bond, a grim family supper that stitched them together in their shared damnation. They did not see their acts as evil. To them, the world outside had forsaken them long ago. This was not murder. This was reclamation. Ezekiel's job was no longer that of a cab driver. He had become a hunter, a provider in the oldest, rarest sense. The taxi was his lure, the streets his hunting ground. Yet beneath surface of necessity, something darker festered. With every body he delivered, Ezekiel felt a shift within himself, a quiet erosion of the man he once was. The swamp had its own pulse, and slowly he realized his heartbeat had begun to sync with its rhythm. At night, when the family feasted, he would sit apart, his eyes lost in the shadows that danced on the walls, haunted by theft memory of a conscience that no longer screamed. But the swamp had not only devoured his family's sanity, it had birthed in them a sense of invincibility. Marmon Solar often whispered that the swamp protected them, that the spirits of the drowned shielded their sins. Ruth, though silent, had developed a ritual of her own, weaving small talismans from the hair of their victims, hanging them like trophies above the children's sleeping mats. That children, in their innocence, warped by survival, began to see themselves, not as victims of circumstance, but as chosen, a family blessed with a secret no one else could possess. Ezekiel watched this transformation with a numb detachment, torn between revulsion and the fierce, blinding instinct to protect his own. Every trip into town was a battle, a test of his self-control, to wear the mask of civility. While the predator within sharpened its teeth, the townsfolk still hailed him with casual indifference, never suspecting that beneath the calm nod and polite smile lurked a man whose hands had carved flesh from bone just hours before. But every predator knows that hunger, once awakened, grows bolder. The swamp was no longer satisfied with the drifters, the forgotten souls. It whispered for more, for those closer to home, for victims whose absence would echo louder. And Ezekiel, trapped in the twisted loyalty of a father's love and a son's duty, found himself inching closer to a life from which there would be no return. As the nights grew darker, and the whispers in the swamp grew louder, the shack stood waiting, a grotesque altar hidden from a world that had turned its back long ago. And Ezekiel Graves, the silent cabin of Vicksburg, continued his rides into town, his trunk empty, his family hungry, and the line between man and monster wearing thinner with every mile. By the time the sun dipped below the Mississippi horizon, and the fog began to slither out from the Yuzu River, Ezekiel Graves was already behind the wheel. His cab, a black aged Ford with rust creeping along the doors, moved like a phantom through Vicksburg's back streets. It bore no number, no company name, no sign that it belonged to anything but the man who drove it. To the casual eye, it was just another hack, one of those unofficial taxes that filled the gaps in service for folks who couldn't afford more. But for Ezekiel, it was a trap on wheels, a rolling coffin lined in steel and shadows. Ezekiel had developed an instinct, a sixth sense sharpened by years of watching people who didn't want to be seen. His victims were never chosen at random. He knew who the town wouldn't miss. Travelers lingering too long in the wrong part of town, drunks tossed out of saloons, laborers who finished their shift and had no family waiting at home. He prowled quietly, his eyes darting from sidewalk to sidewalk, scanning faces, reading movements, the ones who looked over their shoulders too often, who stumbled a bit too much, who waved him down with a desperate slur in their voice. These were the ones the swamp would accept. The ritual was always the same, a slow roll to the curb, a polite nod, no need for words. Ezekiel knew the power of silence. He would lean over, push the door open from inside, and the passenger would climb in, grateful for the ride. Once the door shut, however, the cab became something else entirely. Ezekiel had rigged the interior himself, removed the handles, fixed the locks so they clicked silently into place. To the passenger, it seemed like a normal redoindle. It didn't. At first, he'd follow the expected route. He knew every pothole, every lamp post that flickered just right to keep suspicion asleep. His hands on the wheel were calm, steady, his face reflecting nothing but quiet focus. But then the detour would begin. It always started with a subtle turn, a right where it should have been a left, a slip off the main road onto gravel paths that wound deeper into the woods. By the time the passenger noticed, by the time they began to fidget and glance nervously at the windows, they were already in the swamp's territory. Ezekiel never spoke. Words were useless at this stage. The swamp had its own language, the creak of trees, the murmur of water brushing against rotted stumps, the distant cry of something feral and unseen. These sounds were his allies. They filled the cab with a suffocating presence that made even the bravest passenger shrink into silence. Panic always came in stages. First, the quiet shifting in the seat. Then the questions, "Hey, where are we headed?" delivered with a forced, casual tone. Ezekiel's response was always the same. A glance in the rearview mirror, his expression empty, hollow as the swamp itself. Under the driver's seat, within a hand's reach, rested Ezekiel's instrument of certainty, a heavy iron-head hammer. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't theatrical. It was blunt, efficient, a tool designed for one purpose. Ezekiel had learned early that hesitation was fatal. The first strike needed to be perfect, a symphony of speed and force. He'd time it with the bumps in the road, using the car's jerks to mask the moment his hand would shoot down, grip the hammer, and swing it back with terrifying precision. The impact was always immediate, a wet, dull sound that barely echoed within the tight space of the cab. Most never had time to scream. Those who did didn't for long. Ezekiel had practiced this routine until it became muscle memory, a mechanical dance-off predator and prey. Once the deed was done, he'd drive a bit farther into the woods, where the road gave up entirely, where even the bravest townsfolk refused to tread. The swamp waited there, patient and eternal, ready to swallow what the world above rejected. Ezekiel had a spot, a hollow beneath a canopy of cypress, where the ground was soft, the water dark and unmoving. This was where the cab would stop, where the back door would finally creak open, and the lifeless body would be dragged out into the muck. The swamp never judged. It consumed flesh and bone with the same indifference it offered to rotting branches and lost boots. Within days, sometimes hours, the body would vanish beneath layers of silt and reeds, claimed by a wilderness that had been devouring secrets long before Ezekiel was born. But Ezekiel was no careless butcher. He stripped the bodies, removed anything that could linger in memory, jewelry, shoes, papers. The personnel effects were buried deeper in a separate pit he'd dug years ago. His mother, Marmon Solar, had taught him that even the smallest detail could become a ghost if left unchecked. "You don't just kill the body, Zeke," she once said, her eyes glassy with the fervor of old superstitions. "You kill the name, the memory. You hush the world that speaks of them." Every ride left Ezekiel emptier, but he wore his mask with precision. Back in town, no one questioned why his cab was always clean, why the back seat never smelled of anything but old leather. He scrubbed it religiously, as if the act itself was a baptism, washing away the night's sins before the sun could rise. The townsfolk remained blissfully indifferent. After all, they never asked where the drunks and drifters went. In a place like Vicksburg, disappearances were as common as rain. But the swamp knew, and Ezekiel knew. Each ride, each strike of the hammer chipped away at the line that separated necessity from desire. What began as survival had begun to morph into something else, a grim mastery, an artistry of control that fed not only his family's bellies, but a deeper, darker hunger that words failed to define. Ezekiel's cab became infamous in whispers, yet no one dared confront them. To do so would mean confronting the town's own neglect, its willingness to let certain souls vanish without a ripple. And so the cycle continued. The passengers kept climbing in, the locks kept jamming shut, and the swamp kept devouring as the nights rolled on. Ezekiel felt the swamp's rhythm pulse beneath his skin, guiding his hand, dulling his conscience. He was no longer just a man driving a cab. He had become an extension of the swamp itself, a foramen of flesh, delivering offerings to a wilderness that had no God, no mercy, only hunger, and with each ride, the swamp's grip on him tightened. The swamp was never silent, even in the dead of night, when the stars shivered and the wind held its breath. The yuzu marsh whispered. It murmured through the reeds, hummed beneath the moss-draped cypress, and if you listened closely, if you dared, you could hear the bones speak. They piled up year after year, a hidden harvest beneath the muck and water, fed by the quiet hands of Ezekiel graves. Yet bones, as Mar and Solar would often mutter, are treacherous. They do not rot as flesh does. They remember, and sometimes they whisper back. Ezekiel had been careful. The bodies he delivered to the swamp were stripped, their remnants buried deep, their names erased in the hope that the water would consume all traces. But as years wore on, the swamp became saturated, bloated with a weight that no amount of mud could conceal. Bones began to surface in strange places not where Ezekiel had left them. A femur lodged in the roots of a cypress, a rib cage tangled in the reeds after a storm, skulls rising like pale grinning boys when the water receded. The swamp, it seemed, was growing restless. Marmon Solar, Ezekiel's mother, understood before any else. She was a woman molded by old superstitions, her mind a labyrinth of whispered folklores and forgotten conjures. To her, the swamp was alive, a hungry, breathing entity that required balance. Flesh fed it, yes, but bones were sacred. They were to be honored, not discarded like trash. They be keys, Zeke, she'd say, her voice raspy as dried leaves. Bones open doors, they open mouths. You don't hush them, they'll speak. Marmon Solar began collecting them. At first it was subtle. A skull brought back under her shawl, a handful of phalanges cradled like river pebbles. She cleaned them with a care that bordered on reverence, boiling them in a black iron pot over the shack's dwindling fire. Then she'd sit for hours carving into them with a thin rusted blade, inscribing symbols that only she understood, circles, lines, and crosses that twisted into patterns older than the land itself. She crafted charms from the smaller bones, tiny talismans bound with twine, teeth woven into necklaces, ribs fashioned into delicate hanging ornaments. She strung them across the shack's doorway, beneath the windows, above the children's beds. Each one, she claimed, was a ward, a shield against the watchful eyes of the dead. The swamp needs its breath, but it don't need to shout, she told Ezekiel. These hushed the voices. But the swamp was not so easily silenced. The townsfolk began to notice. First, it was fishermen pulling up nets snagged with fragments of bone. Then children playing near the marsh found strange little figures dangling from branches, twisted shapes of bone and hair that fluttered like sinister wind chimes. Women washing clothes at the riverbank whispered of small skulls nestled between the rocks, their hollow eyes staring blankly as if waiting for someone to listen. Fear, once a private murmur among the colored folk, began to ripple outward. The swamp, they said, was breathing differently. It exhaled a stink of old death, and the trees had started to lean in closer. As if listening, the air grew heavier. Dogs refused to approach the marsh paths. Old men who had hunted the swamps their entire lives swore they heard voices at dusk, soft and urgent, weaving through the reeds like a song meant only for the damned. The sheriff's office, uninterested in the problems of poor folk, brushed it off as swamp superstition. But the whispers did not die, they grew teeth. Some said the-bones belonged to those the town had forgotten. Runaways, vagrants, sinners swallowed by their own recklessness. Others, quieter but more insistent, believed it was no accident, that someone was feeding the swamp, keeping it sated with flesh, and that now the swamp was growing tired of its bargain. Marmon Solar paid no mind to the rumors. She continued her work, her fingers nimble despite their Nile stiffness, her eyes gleaming with a fervor that unsettled even Ezekiel. She spoke to the bones as she carved, her whispers soft and rhythmic, as if coaxing secrets from their brittle cages. To her, these charms were not mere trinkets. They were pacts, offerings to the unseen, contracts binding the family's fate to the will of the swamp. But Ezekiel felt the change. Every trip into town, every time his cab's wheels touched pavement, the weight of those whispers pressed heavier against his spine. He began to see things. The glint of bone-white fragments along the roadside, reflections in puddles that didn't match his own. He couldn't shake the feeling that the swamp was bleeding into the town, seeping into the cracks, and that bones, once buried and forgotten, were now markers leading back to him. The townsfolk, too, grew restless. Church sermons tilted toward fire and brimstone, preachers warning of dark sins festering in their midst. Folks avoided the marsh trails even in daylight, and Ezekiel's kept found fewer and few affairs. Yet, the hunger at Theshak remained. His family's needs did not dwindle with the town's fears. And so despite the mounting dread, Ezekiel continued his hunts, each ride a tighter coil of risk and desperation. One morning after a brutal storm, a child found a charm hanging from the fence post of the schoolyard. It was small, delicate, three tiny vertebrae bound together with a strip of leather. The discovery sent a shiver through Vicksburg. Parents pulled their children from school. The local paper, which had never bothered with swamp tales, ran a small column about heathen tokens found near town. Ezekiel read it in silence, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth arched. Mom and Solar only laughed, her thin lips curling as she dangled a freshly carved bone figure from her fingers. They see now. Zeke, the swamp's breath don't stay hidden forever. But Mar and Solar's charms were no longer enough. The swamp's appetite had grown wild, unpredictable. It wasn't just devouring flesh. It was exposing the bones, forcing them to the surface, making sure they were seen. Ezekiel realized with a cold knot tightening in his gut that the swamp was no ally. It was a predator, and predators turned on their feeders once the prey grew scarce still. Marmon Solar continued her rituals, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the tightening noose. Theshak became a shrine of bones, each creak of the floorboards a chorus of brittle whispers, each gust of wind a warning laced in the rattling of hollow remains. Ezekiel's children, once mute spectators, now played with the charms, hanging them like dolls, humming along to their mother's silent hymns. The swamp, once a hiding place, had become a beacon. The whispers it carried now reached beyond its tangled borders, slipping into the town, into the dreams of those who had ignored its presence for too long. Vicksburg could no longer pretend not to hear. The bones were speaking louder, and Ezekiel knew the breath of the swamp was turning into a scream. Caleb Jones arrived in Vicksburg with a notebook in his breast pocket, a sharp pencil behind his ear, and a hunger for stories that the big newspapers in New Orleans wouldn't touch. He was young, restless, and too stubborn to know when to look the other way. The city editors had dismissed the rumors, the whispers of black men and women vanishing without a trace, swallowed by the swamps of Mississippi. To them, it was just another southern tale, a footnote at best. But Caleb had grown up hearing his grandmother's warnings about places where the land had a memory, where the earth itself held grudges. So when he read a small, half-buried column in a colored paper about missing folk near Vicksburg, he knew it was more than coincidence. The town greeted him with that same suffocating politeness reserved for outsiders who didn't know their place. Folks spoke in half sentences, eyes darting away when Caleb asked about Thetis appearances. The sheriff's office barely concealed their disinterest. People come and go, the deputy had muttered, flipping through paperwork as if Caleb wasn't worth the breath. But it was the tone, not the words, that set his instincts alike. This wasn't just neglect. It was avoidance, fear wrapped in indifference. Caleb spent his days walking the town, scribbling notes, pretending to be just another curious visitor. But his nights were different. That's when the town exiled its secrets. And that's when Caleb watched. He noticed the black cab almost immediately. It was impossible to miss once you knew what to look for. The old Ford prowled the streets like a relic that refused to die, gliding from shadow to shadow with a purpose that was too precise to be random. The driver, a tall, dark-skinned man with a face carved from stone, never seemed hurried, never looked lost. He drove as if the roads were veins, and he was the blood keeping them alive. Caleb asked around. The answers were vague, laced with warnings that felt more like thinly veiled threats. "That's Ezekiel," one man said, voice dropping to a hush. "Drives. Folk late at night. Folk you don't see come morning." Another shook his head, muttering about swamp curses and the dangers of poking into things best left alone. But the more they warned him off, the deeper Caleb dug in. He wasn't a man who turned from whispers. He chased them. Night after night, Caleb shadowed the cab from a distance, watching as it collected stragglers from dim-lit corners, folks too desperate to care where the ride would lead. But something gnawed at him. None of these passengers seemed taciturn. They vanished into the night, the cab drifting back alone, as silent as it had arrived. Caleb's curiosity sharpened into obsession. This was an ordinary driver. This was a pattern, a predator's route disguised as a service. The plan formed slowly, calculated in the restless hours of dawn. When sleep evaded him, he would become the next fare, not as a victim, but as bait. He rehearsed it in his mind. Stumble out of a tavern, act drunk, wave the cab down with slurred gratitude, get inside, get close, follow the route. But Caleb wasn't foolish. He knew the risk, so harmed himself. A small pistol tucked into his waistband, a blade sheathed in his boot. He would play the drunk, but his senses would be razor sharp. The night he chose was thick with mist, the kind that curled around your ankles and made the street lamps look like floating orbs. He waited outside a juke joint, swaying as if the world had tilted, watching. As the black cab rolled to a slow stop across the street, the door creaked open, an invitation draped insolence. Caleb approached, heart hammering against his ribs, and slid into the back seat, slurring a thanks that barely left his throat. The door shut with a subtle click that felt far too final. The cab moved, gliding through streets with an unsettling smoothness. At first, the route was familiar, lulling Caleb into a rhythm of awful security. But then came the shift, the detour, a turn where there should have been a straight path, the tire scrunching onto gravel that led toward the swamp's embrace. Caleb's pulse quickened. He could see the driver's face in the rearview mirror, calm, unreadable, like the surface of a pond that hid the depth of its dark waters. The air inside the cab grew heavier, the silence punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine and the distant chorus off Swamp Awakening. Caleb's fingers inched toward the pistol, his mind racing through contingencies. He could see now how easy it was for others to vanish, how simple it was to become a name. No one spoke again. The cab slowed, the trees outside folding into a dense wall of shadow. This was it. Caleb's hand tightened around the pistol grip. His eyes locked on the driver's movements, but Ezekiel did not turn. He reached down beneath his seat, his posture unchanging. Caleb moved. The pistol came up fast, the cold barrel pressing against the back of Ezekiel's head. "Drive back," Caleb hissed, voice low but firm. Right now, Ezekiel's hand froze. For a moment, the cab became atom of stillness, the only sound, the quiet dripping of water from the trees. Then, with a slow, measured motion, Ezekiel lifted his hand back to the wheel and eased the cab forward. Caleb's breath came in shallow bursts. He had one a moment, but he knew it was only that, a moment. The predator was still in control of the terrain. But something shifted as they drove deeper into the woods. Caleb noticed the subtle change in Ezekiel's expression, a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It was anticipation, as if the swamp itself had been waiting. The cab suddenly jerked, the wheels sliding into a rut, sending Caleb off balance. The pistol wavered, and in that heartbeat of hesitation, Ezekiel struck. His elbow shot back with brutal precision, connecting with Caleb's jaw, sending the pistol clattering to the floor. The cab filled with the sounds of struggle, fists pounding against flesh, the confined space turning into a battleground of grunts and gasps. Caleb fought back, years of city brawls igniting in his fists, but Ezekiel was relentless. Driven by a force that felt almost inhuman, they tumbled out of the cab, crashing onto the swamp's edge, the mud swallowing their limbs as they grappled for dominance. Caleb's hand found the blade in his boot, and with a desperate arc, he slashed across Ezekiel's side. The man grunted, momentarily loosening his grip, allowing Caleb to scramble free. Breathless and blooded, Caleb staggered back toward the road, the pistol now clutched in trembling hands. Ezekiel didn't chase. He stood by the cab, one hand pressed against his bleeding side, his eyes watching Caleb with a calmness that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't defeat in his stare. It was patience, as if the swamp had already claimed him, and time was irrelevant. Caleb ran, the swamp's whispers nipping at his heels, the cab silhouette lingering in his mind like a specter. He had survived the ride, but he knew this was far from over. Thievery had teeth now, and it had bitten him. The night air was thick, soupy with smell of river mud and the slow decay of the swamp that crouched just beyond Vicksburg's edges. Caleb Jones had been waiting for this night, plotting it with the precision of a man who understood the weight of his own obsession. For days he had stalked Ezekiel's cab like a predator in reverse, watching the way it slid through the streets, silent and patient, a black vessel collecting souls that no one seemed to miss. But tonight was different. Tonight Caleb wasn't just a witness. He was bait. The plan was simple, at least in theory. Dress like Amanda drunk to know better. Stumble out of the juke joint on Magnolia Street. Mumble something about needing a ride home. And let Ezekiel think he was scooping up another forgotten body. But Caleb wasn't drunk. His senses were sharpened, his blade tucked into his boot, and his revolver resting cold and ready against his ribs. He knew Therisks. He had played the scenarios in his mind like a film reel. Yet, none of them could fully prepare him for the moment when Ezekiel's cab finally appeared. It glided up to the curb as if summoned by the swamp itself. The door creaked open, offering no words, no invitation, just the yawning darkness off cab's interior. Caleb's pulse quickened as he approached, forcing a slurred "much obliged, boss," as he collapsed into the back seat. The door shut with a faint click, one that echoed louder in Caleb's mind than it did in reality. His eyes, though half-flitted in a drunkard squint, scanned the interior. That's when he saw it. The handles were gone, cleanly removed, as if they had never existed. The cab was a cage, and now Caleb was locked inside. Ezekiel didn't speak. His eyes flickered in the rear-view mirror, those deep, unreadable pools that never gave away what was stirring beneath. The cab eased forward, its tires humming over the cobblestone streets. At first, the route seemed normal, lulling Caleb into a cruel sense of routine. But then came the shift. A right turn where a left should have been. The soft hiss of tires crunching onto gravel. The street lights grew sparse, swallowed by looming trees as the cab veered toward the swamp's edge. Caleb's fingers drifted to the pistol hidden beneath his jacket, wrapping around the grip with a controlled calmness. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, each pulse a reminder that this was the moment everything hinged upon. The cab's interior seemed to shrink, the air thickening as the woods pressed closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the windows like skeletal hands. The road beneath them had given up, replaced by a path that was more memory than road, a trail worn by Ezekiel's ritualistic roots. He waited for Ezekiel to make his move. The driver's right hand slid down slowly, disappearing beneath his seat. Caleb recognized the motion. It was the moment of the hunt, the second when predator became executioner. But Caleb was ready. He drew the pistol, the click of the hammer cocking, shattering the cab's suffocating silence. "Not tonight," Caleb said, his voice eraser cutting through the air. Ezekiel froze, hissed, hovering just above whatever weapon lay hidden. The cab continued rolling, a ghostly inertia carrying them forward. In the rearview mirror, Caleb saw a change. The calm, detached mask Ezekiel wore cracked at the edges, giving way to something raw, something frantic. The hunter had been cornered, and yet high sighs betrayed no fear, only a simmering calculation. The cab jolted suddenly, veering hard to the right. Caleb's body slammed against the door, the pistol momentarily wavering. In that instant of fimblance, Ezekiel struck. His hand shot back with lightning precision, knocking Caleb's arm aside, the pistol firing a wild shot that buried itself into the ceiling. The confined space exploded into chaos, fists and limbs entangling in a vicious struggle. Ezekiel fought like a man possessed, his movements fueled by a desperation that felt less human and more primal, as though the swamp's hunger had fused itself into his very bones. Caleb managed to land a knee into Ezekiel's side, forcing a grunt from the driver. His hand found the blade in his boot, pulling it free in a swift, practiced motion. The cab careened wildly, tires spitting mud as it skidded along the swamp's edge. With a surge of strength, Caleb slashed it upward, the blade catching Ezekiel along. His ribs, a spray of blood painted the cab's interior, and for a heartbeat, Ezekiel recoiled, his body twisting from the pain. But pain was not enough to stop him. With a guttural roar, Ezekiel lashed back, his elbow connecting with Caleb's temple. The world spun. The pistol slipped from his grasp. His vision blurred, darkness curling at the edges as the cab lurched again, throwing him across the seat. Another blow landed, then another. Caleb's body reacted, but his mind was drowning, sinking into a fog that felt like the swamp itself was pulling him under. The last thing he saw before the blackness claimed him was Ezekiel's face, no longer calm, but twisted with a wild, almost frenzy intensity, as if the predator had finally been unmasked. The cab rolled to a stop in the depths of the swamp, the night swallowing it whole. When Caleb awoke, the world was wrong. The air was heavier, laced with a stench of damp rot and iron-rich blood. His head throbbed with a dull, merciless ache, and every breath felt like it scraped against the inside of his chest. He was no longer in the cab. He was somewhere else, somewhere where the swamp's whispers were louder, more articulate. Shadows flickered, not from lamplight, but from firelight, distant, flickering, and malevolent. He was tied, wrists bound with coarse rope that patindo his skin. The ground beneath him was soft, yielding like flesh, the damp earth seeping into his clothes. Through haze of pain, he heard movement, footsteps, the shuffle of feet to Light-o-be Ezekiel's. Then a hum, a melody carried by a voice that cracked with age, Marmon Solar. As Caleb's vision steadied, he realized he was in a clearing surrounded by totems of bone and hair, grotesque effigies swaying gently in the night breeze. The swamp had not only accepted its offerings, it had become a shrine, and Caleb was the next piece to be added. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the firelight, a blood-soaked cloth pressed to his wound. His eyes, however, were locked on Caleb with an expression that was no longer cold detachment, but something far more dangerous, resentment mixed with admiration. The reporter had survived the ride. Few ever had, but now Caleb was in the swamp's territory. Here, the rules were different. Ezekiel's voice was low, almost reverent. You ain't the first to come sniffing, but you're the first to bite back. His lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. But now you see, boy, the cab was just a ride. The swamp is where it ends. Caleb's body had, but his mind sharpened. The ride had gone wrong, but the story wasn't over. Not yet. The world was slow to return to Caleb Jones. Consciousness came in fragments. First sound of water dripping steadily somewhere above. Then the sharp coppery tang of blood in his mouth. And finally the oppressive heat of bodies close by, breathing in shallow, hungry rhythms. His eyes blinked open to a dim, flickering glow. The shack was more shadow than wood, a place that felt less like a home and more like a stomach, digesting everything within it. He was tied, wrists bound tightly behind his back, ankles lashed together with ropeso course. It had already begun to shred his skin. The air was thick with the smell of rot, not fresh death, but old festering hunger that seemed to emanate from the very walls. They surrounded him, Ezekiel's family, facade that should have belonged to the living, but didn't. Hollowed cheeks, sunken ice that glimmered with a hunger so deep it had swallowed their humanity whole. The wife, Ruth, sat curled in a corner, rocking back and forth with a motion that matched the creaking of the shack. Her hair hung in greasy ropes, her lips moving soundlessly as though chanting to herself. The children, 3 of them, watched Caleb with blank expressions, their thin limbs wrapped around each other, their eyes following his every twitch like predators, too weak to pounce, but too far gone to blink. And then there was Marmon Solar. She was perched by the hearth, though no fire burned. Her fingers danced across bones, small, delicate ones strung together with bits of sinew, crafting charms that swayed gently in the humid air. She hummed as she worked, a melody that was almost soothing if it hadn't been laced with such quiet menace. Caleb recognized the tune. It was a lullaby his grandmother had sung to him as a child. Hearing it here, in this place, twisted it into something grotesque. Ezekiel stood in the doorway, a silhouette framed by the flickering lantern light, his side still seeping blood from Caleb's earlier strike. yet he seemed unfazed, as if pain was a trivial matter in the grand scheme of what was about to unfold. His eyes locked on Caleb, unblinking, filled with a calm that felt more dangerous than any fury. "You should have stayed in New Orleans, boy," Ezekiel said, his voice soft, measured. "You came hunting stories, but now you're just another chapter." He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight, and for the first time, Caleb felt the shack itself was alive, shifting with every breath of its inhabitants. Marmon Solar's humming grew louder. The children began to echo at Ina's soft, discordant harmony. It was a ritual, and Caleb understood what came next. The rope bit deeper as he struggled, but panic was not an option. He forced his mind to focus. His fingers, slick with sweat and blood, began working the knots behind his back. Slowly, methodically, he couldn't pour them. He had to outthink them. Every second was a countdown he couldn't hear, but he could feel it pulsing in the walls. In the swamp's breath that seeped through the cracks, Marmon Solar approached, her frail hands clutching an necklace of teeth. She leaned in close, her breath sour with decay, her eyes sharp with a lucidity that made Caleb's skin crawl. "The swamp accepts you," she whispered, looping the necklace over his head, her fingers grazing his throat. "You'll feed us well." But Caleb was no longer listening. His fingers had found a weakness in the rope, a frayed edge worn thin. His thumb and forefinger worked feverishly, the knot loosening millimeter by millimeter. Every glance they spared him was an opportunity. They saw him as prey, already defeated. That mistake would be their undoing. Ezekiel moved to a small table cluttered with knives, cleavers dulled by use, but still deadly in the right hands. He picked one up, testing its weight, turning it in his palm as though choosing the right instrument was a formality. Ruth's rocking quickened. The children began to murmur words Caleb didn't understand. The ritual was accelerating. The rope slipped free. Caleb kept his hands behind his back, masking his liberation. His eyes scanned the shack, the lantern on the table, its flame wavering, the pile of kindling near the hearth. The swamp's wet breath had made everything damp, but it only took a spark, a distraction, a weapon. Marmon Solar raised a bone charm to the ceiling, her voice rising in a chant that reverberated through the shack's shallow ribs. Ezekiel stepped forward, the cleaver gleaming dully. Caleb waited until he was close enough to feel the heat of his breath, to smell the iron tang of his blood-soaked shirt. Then he moved. In one swift motion, Caleb lunged, grabbing the lantern and hurling it into the pile of kindling. The glass shattered, and the flame, hungry and immediate, leapt to life. Voracious hiss. The family recoiled, their chants fracturing into screams. Ruth shrieked, her body thrashing as if the fire had touched her soul before her flesh. The children scattered, wailing, their hollow voice blending with the crackle of burning wood. Ezekiel lunged, but Caleb was faster. He drove his shoulder into Ezekiel's chest, sending the man sprawling into the collapsing table. The cleaver clattered away. Caleb didn't wait. He kicked the door open, the night air rushing in, smoke billowing out. But the swamp wasn't offering salvation. It was watching, its reflection caught in the flames that now consumed the shack. Behind him, the screams twisted into something animalistic. Marmon Solar's voice cut through the roar, a guttural wail that was less of fear and more of fury, as if the swamp itself was mourning its sacrificial chamber. The roof groaned, sagging inward, embers cascading like fiery rain. Caleb didn't look back. He ran, his legs churning through the marsh's grip, lungs burning, the fire's glow painting his path with flickering shadows. The shack became a beacon in the swamp, an inferno that illuminated the bones strung across the trees, the grotesque ornaments of Ezekiel's legacy. The screams faded only when the flames claimed the walls, reducing them to a skeletal blaze. But Caleb knew the swamp would not forget. It never forgot. He had silenced the house of hunger, but the echoes of what had been fed there would linger long after the ashes cooled. He stumbled onto a dirt path, coughing, blooded, butylative. The town's faint lights were distant, but they were there, a tether to the world of the living. As he limped headforward, Caleb realized the story he had chased had consumed him, but he had survived the swamp. He had lived to tell it, and some stories refused to stay buried. The fire had not claimed him. The swamp, for all its hunger, had not swallowed him whole. Ezekiel Grave stumbled from the inferno, a specter born from flame and vengeance. Half his face was gone, melted into a grotesque mask of raw flesh and charred bone. His right eye, now a hollow pit, stared blankly, while the other gleamed with a venomous clarity that could only belong to a man who had crawled out of death's moor. The fire had taken his family, his shack, his sanctuary, but it had not taken his rage that still simmered hotter than any flame. He should have it in that swamp. The gods, the spirits, whatever forces whispered through the cypress trees, had decreed it. But Ezekiel was not a man who obeyed. He emerged from the ashes with his purpose twisted, no longer driven by the quiet necessity of survival, but by a raw, seething hatred. His cab, blackened by soot, yet still intact, waited for him at the edge of the marsh, as loyal and patient as ever. The swamp had spared them both. Now they were not just driver and machine. They were avengers, predators, and tethered from need to hide. Vicksburg did not recognize him when he returned. The scars had restructured his face into something unholy, something the mind refused to reconcile with memory. He was just another broken man limping through town's veins, a drifter who belonged to no one. The townsfolk looked away, their gazes sliding off him like water off oil. They did not see Ezekiel. They did not want to. But his cab still rolled the streets, its tires humming the same predatory lullaby, and this time the rides were no longer about feeding the swamp. They were about revenge. Ezekiel no longer hunted Thoswa wouldn't be missed. That had been the old him, the cautious man who calculated each disappearance like Alliger entry. Now his victims were chosen with cold precision, those who had turned blind eyes, who had whispered and gossiped but never acted. The barkeep who had served him for years without ever acknowledging his name. The factory overseer who laughed when colored folk went missing. The preacher who preached mercy on Sundays. Butignered the sins fermenting in his own backyard. They were all fair now, each one a passenger on Ezekiel's final route. The killings became erratic, not in their method, but in their lack of subtlety. Victims vanished in broad night, their last known location always the same, the back seat of a blackened cab that had no business still running. No one wanted to believe it. The town wove its denials with frantic fingers, but whispers grew louder. Folks claimed to see the cab lurking at crossroads, its headlights flickering like twine eyes. The driver's silhouette deformed, hunched as if the fire still weighed on his bones. Rumors swirled of ghostly rides of passengers who climbed in, but were never seen again. Their screams muffled by the cab's closing doors. Boudinot is a fragile shield. One misty morning, as the sun struggled to pierce through the swamp's breath, a farmer found Ezekiel's body hanging from an ancient tree near the old marsh road. The rope bit into what remained of his neck, his scarred face frozen in a grotesque sneer, as if mocking the town heaven and death. His hands hung limp, but his fingers were curled as though still gripping the cab's wheel. No note, no explanation, just a body swaying gently in the dawn breeze, a pendulum marking the end of a blood-soaked legacy. The sheriff's men cut him down. With more relief than reverence, they buried him at the edge of the swamp, far from the churchyard. In a shallow grave that spoke more of fear than closure, the cab was towed to a junkyard, or so they claimed, yet the whispers persisted, stronger, louder, because the cab was still seen. On foggy nights, when the mist rolled in thick and heavy, folks said you could hear it, the low hum of an engine that didn't belong to any living driver. The black cab would appear at deserted crossroads, headlights dim and flickering, as though struggling to exist in a world that had tried to erase it. The driver's silhouette was always the same, hunched, half-faced, a grotesque figure whose one remaining eye glowed faintly behind the wheel. Some said if you were foolish enough to hail the cab, the door would open for you, slow and deliberate. You'd step inside, and the world outside would vanish the moment the door clicked shut. The cab would never take you where you asked. Instead, it would veer off furrowed down forgotten paths into the heart of the swamp where the trees were spare, and the ground swallowed sound. No one knew what happened after that. No one returned to tell the tale, but thieveries grew. A young woman claimed her brother vanished after flagging down a cab on Magnolia Street. An old Mansouri saw the cab parked outside his window, engine idling. Though his house was a mile from the nearest road, the preacher who had once ignored the disappearances was found babbling incoherently, muttering about a riddle that never ended, his mind shattered beyond repair. Ezekiel Graves had become a ghost, but not the kind that fades with time. He and his cab were stitched into the fabric of Vicksburg's nights, a constant reminder that some debts, when ignored long enough, collect themselves. The townspeople learned to avoid traveling after dark, to stay away from swamps roads, to teach their children that not all rides were meant to be taken. But still, every now and then, someone would vanish, no signs of struggle, no witnesses, just the faint echo of tires on gravel and the lingering stench of river rot. And in the quiet hours before dawn, if you listened closely, you could still hear it, the hum of a black cab drifting through the fog, its driver unseen, but no tupset, waiting, watching, offering one last fare to those who thought they could outrun the